you know the centre of gravity?
It's got a structure, whether it's
in session. I understand the Attorney General is ready to expunge the first part from the indictment. He will rest his case on the other charges.
I'm content. It means that the jury must exclude from their minds altogether any prejudice against the prisoner on account of his fascist opinions and the means whereby he established his fascist dictatorship in Italy. The Attorney General has agreed that the condemnation of the prisoner as a fascist would involve so many complications and subtleties and embarrassments that the charge must not be pursued. The procedure of this court is therefore brought into conformity with the practices and principles of foreign policy which were supposed to prevail at the time of the prisoner's rise to power. Now, let me turn to the other particulars of the indictment. The treacherous attack on Abyssinia and the war treacherously pursued in Spain. It further accuses the prisoner of having increasingly assisted Nazi Germany in her attack on the free world. Treachery to whom? Treason is a crime tolerably well defined, but it assumes for its definition the existence of a national state to which the criminal is treacherous. This cannot be the meaning in the present instance, for as proof of the prisoner's treachery, the Attorney General has cited a number of broken international obligations. What then does the Attorney General mean? I can only assume that he's employing the word treacherous in a much more loose and more general application. He is accusing the prisoner of having deceived by his actions those who he had led by his words to put their faith in his conduct. If that is what the Attorney General had in mind, and I'm sure it must be, then I'm left wondering whether there's any ground for the accusation whatsoever. It appears to me that in foreign affairs, the prisoner has proved himself one of the most consistent statesmen of modern times. From the attack on Corfu in 1923 until the attack on Albania in 1939, the principal conduct upheld and acted upon by the prisoner appears to have been uniform, unalterable, and almost monotonous in character. His conduct would compare favourably, for instance, with the consistency of a person like Lady Astor. who was violently anti-German in 1919, violently pro-German in 1938, and violently anti-German again in 1943. The prisoner promulgated several of the principles of foreign policy which he later put into effect as early as 1919, 1920, 1921. In October 1926, the prisoner made a visit to Africa, during which he spoke of Italy's seafaring mission and her intention to seek domination over the Mediterranean. In March 1928, he went out of his way to repudiate the aphorism that fascism is not an article for export. The phrase, he said, is too banal for me. Today I affirm that fascism, as regard to idea, doctrine and realisation, is universal. There was hardly a year in which the prisoner admitted to give warning of his intentions to the world. Within 10 years, he said, in 1932, Europe will be modified and will be fascist. Again, in 1934, war is to a man as maternity is to a woman. I do not believe in perpetual peace. And again, war alone brings up to its highest tension all human energy and puts the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to meet it. From these quotations, it appears that the prisoner did not seek to disguise his aims. Where then is the deception or treachery? Treachery implies treachery to something. In this case, according to the indictment, it implies treachery to a standard of international morality. It is the breach of so many international obligations which deeply shocks the Attorney General. I wonder where he and the Crown, which instructed him, gained this austere view of international ethics. I will seek to prove not merely that the standards of international morality which the prisoner is alleged to have defied were not very well defined, at least in the minds of great numbers of eminent and responsible persons. I will seek to prove also that insofar as those standards were defined, the prisoner was held to be relatively innocent. Now, I will call on the Lord Chancellor, Lord Simon. Lord Simon, at what date did you become Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs?
1932.
And at what date did you vacate that high office?
In 1935.
What was your first association as Foreign Secretary with the prisoner?
It concerned the Four-Power Pact.
What was the date?
The Four-Power Pact was signed in Rome in March 1933 by England, France, Germany and Italy.
What were the purposes of the pact?
The four powers were to declare their intention to coordinate their European policy.
The speed with which you, Lord Simon, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, accepted the invitation and went to Rome must have represented for the prisoner a considerable triumph. What was the next major occasion when you had dealings with the prisoner?
The Strasser Conference.
Who else was present beside yourself?
Mussolini, Flandin, Laval and Ramsay MacDonald.
Oh, an inspiring company. What was the purpose of the conference?
Germany had just renounced the disarmament clauses of the Versailles Treaty and made an announcement about conscription. The three powers concerned expressed their great unity of purpose and reaffirmed their interest in Austrian independence. The resolution to which they put their names condemned any unilateral repudiation of treaties which may endanger the peace of Europe.
The peace of Europe?
Yeah.
Did anyone mention Africa?
Abyssinia was discussed unofficially.
The prisoner claims that he understood from this conference, as he had previously understood from Monsieur Laval, that France and Britain were not vitally interested in Abyssinia. I will spare you the indignity of reply. I've examined the division records of the House of Commons and discover that in April 1938 you voted approving the Anglo-Italian agreement, which included the recognition of the conquest of Abyssinia among its prominent items. As for the peace in Europe, thank you, I would like to call Sir Samuel Hoare. Samuel Hoare, what was your first association with the prisoner?
In 1915, when I went to Italy on a special mission.
An old acquaintance. We will not trouble you, Sir Samuel, with the details. There are, however, a few points concerning the Abyssinian affair.
I became Foreign Secretary in 1935, and on July the 11th, some time after the Abyssinian dispute had already come before the League, I made my view clear. I made it clear that we had always understood, and well understood, Italy's desire for overseas expansion. Indeed, we had in the past done our best to show sympathy with Italian aspirations in a practical way. In 1925, we ceded Jubaland to Italy, and in the negotiations at that time, we showed our willingness to endeavour to ensure for Italy some territorial satisfaction by a reasonable and legitimate arrangement with Abyssinia. I admitted the need for Italian expansion. I informed MPs that they could dismiss from their minds the rumours that we had asked the French government to join in the blockade of Italy, a country that had been our friend since the Risorgimento.
That is the most interesting statement, Sir Samuel. It must have been most comforting to MPs and also to Signor Mussolini. Comforting for him to learn that no blockade was in prospect even at that date, the middle of July. The prisoner tells me that already 2 months before, he had announced quite openly his decision to make himself thoroughly safe in Africa, and at the beginning of July he proclaimed his inexorable decision to avenge Adour, where the Abyssinians had defeated the Italians in 1896. Do you think he ever received a warning of British displeasure sufficiently emphatic to make him reconsider that decision?
I cannot answer for the prisoner.
The full story of what happened has been told by Monsieur Laval. It is a story of a secret agreement between Monsieur Laval and Sir Samuel Hoare, according to which, in Laval's statement, we found ourselves instantaneously in agreement upon ruling out military sanctions, not adopting any measure of naval blockade, never contemplating the closure of the Suez Canal. I suggest that from September the 10th onwards, Signor Mussolini was fully aware that we need have no fear of incurring the armed enmity of the great powers. I suggest that it explains his bellicose speeches, his defiance of Geneva, and his apparent readiness to risk the hostility of 52 states. I suggest that it assists in explaining the ease with which Sir Samuel's conscience approved the conquest of Abyssinia in 1938. I suggest it indicates a condonation of this particular crime alleged against the prisoner by some eminent persons before it was committed. Thank you. I'd like to call my next witness, Mr. Neville Chamberlain. Mr. Chamberlain, before the elections in 1935, did you not say that the issue was not Abyssinia but the fate of the League? And whether by a cowardly surrender we were to break a promise we had made and hold ourselves up to the shame of our children, their children's children? Were those your words?
Yes, they were.
Now, Mr. Chamberlain, at what point after the election did you change your mind?
About July 1936, the League of Nations issued a circular to its members in which it said that if it were to pursue a policy of sanctions, it was still possible to preserve the independence of Abyssinia. I described that policy as the very midsummer of madness. I felt that if we pursued that policy, it would only lead to further misfortunes, which would divert our minds as practical men from seeking better solutions.
And when did you start trying to seek better solutions?
When I became Prime Minister a year later.
You did not feel that your election pledges in any way precluded you from entering into negotiations with the prisoner?
I made up my mind, as I told the House of Commons, that the quarrel between us rested largely upon unfounded misunderstandings. I was brought a personal letter from Signor
So the
Mussolini.
whole initiative was taken by the prisoner?
Yes.
That didn't make you suspicious?
No. The note was a friendly character, and I felt we were presented with an opportunity for opening negotiations which should not be missed. I sent a personal reply in cordial terms.
What did you say?
I said that I believed that good relations could be restored between our two countries if we could clear away certain misunderstandings. I declared our readiness to enter into negotiations.
And did the negotiations start at once?
No, about 8 months later, in February 1938.
Now, Mr. Chamberlain, by this time, what opinion had you formed of the prisoner's character?
I told the House of Commons. that I was confident his government would approach the negotiations in the same spirit that we would do, namely, in perfect good faith and with a sincere desire to reach agreement.
So your estimate of the prisoner's character was such that you trusted him absolutely?
It was necessary to show a spirit of trust if any agreement was to be reached.
You're evading the question. Was not your trust in the prisoner unwavering and absolute?
I never said that.
No, but you said quite as much. Did you not say that if you were fooled by Signor Mussolini, you would eat your hat?
Yes.
Then I suggest that by making this somewhat superfluous offer about your headgear, you were in fact paying the most exaggerated compliment to the good character of my client. Now, Mr. Chamberlain, we must hasten to the agreement itself. When you started these conversations with Signor Mussolini, is it not a fact that a war in Spain was in progress and that Italian troops were supposed to be participating?
Yes.
In stating your conversations, did you make any conditions about Spain?
I told the Italian ambassador it is essential that the situation in Spain should not be materially altered by Italy sending fresh reinforcements to Franco. And I demanded the withdrawal of foreign volunteers.
Was this undertaking accepted by the Italian government?
Yes.
And was it reiterated in the Anglo-Italian agreement initialed in Rome in 1938?
Yes.
And was the Italian undertaking about Spain carried out?
It was always difficult to determine the exact number of foreign troops
Oh.
in Spain.
Come, Mr. Chamberlain. Was it not a fact that in August 1938, after the agreement had been signed, and after the motion for the recognition of the conquest of Abyssinia had been passed at Geneva, your representative in Rome confronted the Italian government with charges of renewed intervention in Spain? The answers are on the records, and there is further evidence which clinches the point. Lord Halifax was associated with you, was he not?
Yes.
You had no secrets from one another?
No, of course not.
I will remind you, Lord Halifax stated, Signor Mussolini has always made it plain to His Majesty's government that he was not prepared to see General Franco defeated. Were you aware of that information too?
Yes.
Then, gentlemen, despite that knowledge, Mr. Chamberlain was ready to pay tribute to the perfect good faith of the prisoner, and even to sign a treaty with him. Yet I must remind the jury that the charge of having treacherously participated in this Spanish war figures in the indictment. However, not merely did Chamberlain not regard the prisoner's activities in Spain as constituting a blemish on his character, he was even ready to pay tribute to the positive services which the prisoner performed in the service of peace. I will put the matter to the witness. What part did Signor Mussolini play in the Munich conference?
His contribution was certainly notable, and perhaps decisive. It was on his suggestion that the final stages of the German mobilization were postponed 24 hours to give me an opportunity of discussing the situation. As I told the House of Commons, I think that Europe and the world has reason to be grateful to the head of the Italian government for his work in contributing to a peaceful solution.
I hope the jury will take proper account of that generous tribute to the prisoner from the man who is more usually regarded as the architect of Munich. Mr. Chamberlain, was Munich the last occasion on which you had the privilege of seeing the prisoner?
No, I saw him again in January 1939.
Where?
In Rome.
Was that another political conference?
It was more social, a festive occasion.
Were there no political discussions?
Well, our discussions were exploratory and informal.
Was there any special ceremony?
Yes. It was a state banquet.
Were you the guest of honour?
Yes. Myself and Lord Halifax and King Victor Emmanuel.
Did you make a speech?
None of great importance.
Not even in reply to a toast?
Oh, yes, there was some toast. I answered one by Mussolini.
Would you please repeat to the court the exact words which you employed?
Assuring your excellency that I value highly your expressions of personal friendship, and with the hope that our two nations may together cooperate in the task of securing a lasting peace in Europe, I raise my glass to His Majesty, the King of Italy, the Emperor of Ethiopia, and to the continued welfare and prosperity of the peoples over whom he rules.
That is enough. I would like to call Lord Halifax. You were also present, were you not, at the state banquet in Rome in 1939?
Yes.
Did you drink Mr. Chamberlain's toast to the new Emperor of Ethiopia?
Yes.
Do you recall a meeting you had with the previous Emperor of Ethiopia?
Yes.
And where was it?
At Geneva.
What was the subject of discussion on that occasion?
The Anglo-Italian Agreement of 1938. I was asking for the approval of the League for it.
And also for approval for the recognition of the conquest of Abyssinia?
Yes.
Did you not on this occasion feel there was some moral issue involved in the recognition of a conquest which your country had sworn to prevent?
I said that the question did seem to impinge on principle.
Impinge is a good word.
I also discussed the eternal and immutable moralities. I said that when two ideals were in conflict, on one hand the ideal of devotion, unflinching but impractical, on the other hand, the ideal of a practical victory for peace. I could not doubt that the stronger claim was that of peace.
On this reckoning, Lord Halifax, we can only assume that the second Emperor of Ethiopia, whom you had the opportunity of meeting, was a more worthy man than the first. Did you gain unanimous approval at Geneva for your moral doctrines? Or were there any countries who took a different view?
There were some objectors.
Who?
New Zealand, Bolivia, China, and the Soviet Union.
Gentlemen of the jury, you will see that, except in the minds of these four countries, it was not considered morally wrong to condone the conquest of Abyssinia. I would like to call Mr. Ellis Amory. Let us go back to 1935. What was your view of the Abyssinian dispute?
None of the territories which it was suggested that Italy should control was inhabited by Abyssinians, but had been conquered by them. And such land would have been much better off under the control of a civilized nation than under the cruel and incompetent Abyssinians.
That was the prisoner's belief too. He'll be glad of your commendation. How do you feel that this issue affected the general situation in Europe?
I wanted there to be an avoidance of a definite crystallization into two hostile leagues. Ourselves, Russia and France, on one side, and Germany, Italy and Japan on the other. I could imagine no combination of world politics more deadly to the British Empire.
Mr. Amory, your politics appear consistent and unfortunate. You have lived to see the combination of powers which you regarded as deadly to the British Empire, but that's not the point. The jury will note, I hope, that you regarded the whole idea of condemning the prisoner for his action in Abyssinia as senseless from beginning to end. Thank you. I will now call Mr. Duff Cooper. Mr. Duff Cooper, I would like you to take up a few points of evidence just about the period where Mr. Amory left off. What was your view of the correct policy towards Italy after the sanctions period? Let's say about 1937.
I was in favour of letting bygones be bygones. I felt that between Italy and England there could never be any serious misunderstanding. Our friendship with Italy was very ancient, despite the little opposition put to Julius Caesar when he first landed.
You wrote an article on Italy in November 1938. Could you quote to us the relevant passages from that?
From the march on Rome until the invasion of Abyssinia, the influence of Mussolini in the councils of Europe was definitely on the side of peace. There seems to be no reason why the interest of Great Britain and those of Italy should ever clash. Italy has urgent need of peace to consolidate her empire. Her European frontiers are satisfactory, she has scope for colonisation in Africa, and a highly civilised population abominates war.
The prisoner will be most grateful to you for your flattering references to his services to peace. I will now call a witness, thank you, from the other house. Lord Mottistone. What were your views of the Italian action in Abyssinia?
I did not oppose it.
What were your reasons for this view?
I wanted to dispel the ridiculous illusion that it was a nice thing to sympathise with the underdog. The rule of the Abyssinians was to mutilate while alive and then to bury in the sand to die. There was then 1 million of these people, and I hoped that those who wanted to hold meetings against the Italians would remember that these desperate men were then face to face with the gallant boys from Italy.
Did you have any first-hand information on this subject?
I telegraphed General Di Bono on the question of slavery in Abyssinia.
And what was his reply?
He replied that the Italian troops have been welcomed with the most touching enthusiasm, not only by those who have been reduced to slavery, but also by the average population.
Did the telegram say anything about Italian atrocities?
It stated that the Italian command had taken every measure to protect lives and property. Damage and loss which the native population might incur was to be fully compensated.
And did you make any use of this priceless information?
Yes. I revealed it all to the House of Lords on October the 23rd, 1935. I said that the answer was to Mussolini's eternal honour.
I cannot imagine a more touching tribute to the more tender side of the prisoner's character. I will now call Mr. Leslie Horbelisha, former Secretary of State for War. Now, Mr. Horbelisha, you were a member of Mr. Chamberlain's government.
Yes.
You were a member of it when the Anglo-Italian agreement was signed.
Yes.
And was it not you who was the first member of Mr. Chamberlain's government to pay a visit to Rome following the conclusion of that treaty?
Yes, I must have been.
Did you make any comments referring to the prisoner?
Possibly I did.
Come, Mr. Horbelisha, you can hardly have forgotten. Did you not say, on the 24th of April 1938, that the opportunity you had had of meeting Il Duce would always be a pleasant memory for you?
I suppose I did.
Was there not some little ceremony between you and Il Duce?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, did not the prisoner present you with a bronze medallion?
Yes.
And was not that medallion inscribed with the words, "For fortitude and valour"? Mr. Horbelisha, I think you should be prouder of your emblem. I will now call Lord Lloyd. I believe you became a member of Mr. Churchill's government in 1940.
Yes.
What was your position before that?
I was head of the British Council.
Oh, what was or is the British Council?
It was, is, a body concerned with the task of putting the British case in foreign countries.
And what were the qualifications which entitled you to put forward the British case?
Our activities were approved by the Foreign Office.
And did you have anything to say in your propaganda, if I may use the appropriate term, about the prisoner?
We did make some mention of him.
In what form?
I wrote a pamphlet,
Well, what was its name?
The British Case.
I know the pamphlet. Would you be good enough to read to the court your references to Italy, appearing on pages 37 and 38?
The Italian genius has developed in the fascist institutions a highly authoritarian regime which, however, threatens neither religious or economic freedom, nor the security of other European nations. It is worthwhile to note that quite fundamental differences exist between the structure and principles of the fascist state and those of the Nazi and Soviet states. The Italian system is founded on two rocks. First, the separation of church and state, and the supremacy of the church in matters not only of faith, but of morals. Second, the rights of labour. The political machinery of fascism is indeed built upon trade unionism, while that of the German state is built on the ruins of the German labour movement.
Thank you. That seems most comprehensive. What date did this tribute appear?
1940.
It seems very late. Are you sure the jury will be right in taking this as a semi-official expression of the Foreign Office? Or does it only express your private views?
Of course, it expresses my own views.
And did not the publication of the pamphlet call for some rebuke from the authorities?
No.
How do you account for that?
It had a preface of commendation from Lord Halifax.
What was his position then?
Foreign Secretary.
So it was a semi-official pamphlet. Indeed, almost official. Thank you. Gentlemen of the jury, I hope you'll agree that I've brought before you a most imposing set of witnesses. And I hope also you'll agree that their testimony provides a coherent body of evidence which points to a few definite and inescapable conclusions. It is true, of course, that I could have called other witnesses who would have given contrary testimony. Throughout this period, when Anglo-Italian relations figured so prominently in world affairs, a record number of debates on foreign issues took place in the House of Commons, and a record number of votes of censure were put down on the order paper by the Liberal and Labour parties. However, this surely cannot be held to alter my plea. Most of the witnesses who have appeared before you were prominent members of the ruling party of the day. They had all the facts at their disposal, and their views, as you'll be able to see, were quite decided. Now, what are the precise conclusions of a major nature which we are justified in making of this recital of evidence? I've already suggested that the charge of treachery is fantastic. You have now seen the long-distance plans of the prisoner were made so plain in his own words. It is true that the plans of the prisoner were deplored at various intervals by some of the witnesses, but in no cases were the crimes alleged to have been committed sufficiently grave to warrant final displeasure, much less condemnation of my client. In 1939, Mr. Chamberlain is still congratulating himself on the possession of the personal friendship of the prisoner. Lord Halifax, Sir Samuel Hoare, Lord Simon, Mr. Amory, Mr. Duff Cooper have all voted to condone and recognise the conquest of Abyssinia, even though the war is still continuing in Spain, and some go even further than others. Mr. Amory thinks all the past quarrels senseless. Mr. Duff Cooper wants bygones to be bygones. Lord Mottistone speaks of the eternal honour of the prisoner. Mr. Horbelisha accepts a bronze medallion from him. All are agreed that his past peccadilloes, if peccadilloes they be, provide no obstacle to the most harmonious relations between themselves and the prisoner. Gentlemen, we do not normally put our trust in thieves, make new concord with traitors, or shake hands with murderers. I can only assume, therefore, that up to this date, the prisoner must be absolved from any of these charges which have been bandied about so freely by the prosecution. Could Abyssinia have been conquered by the armies of Italy if the policy of the British government had been dictated by the speech of September the 11th, 1935, rather than by the private compact of the previous day? Could Spain have been successfully invaded without the assistance of Mr. Chamberlain and Lord Halifax? Could Italy have brought such assistance to Nazi Germany if her prestige and power had not been enhanced from the day Lord Simon went to Rome in 1933 to the day Mr. Chamberlain went there in 1939? Gentlemen, if these high personages are also to be condemned, then perhaps the alleged crimes of the prisoner might assume a recognisable character. But if they are guiltless, I cannot see by what standard the guilt of the prisoner is to be established. Gentlemen, I demand once more that the indictment be quashed. I warn the Attorney General he is treading on dangerous ground.
I must confess that I consider his case formidable in the extreme. However, since the case is unique, I am bound to decide that the trial must proceed. I understand that the Attorney General has a short statement to make.
It seems that the learned gentleman has decided to transform this court into a political demonstration of a nature particularly odious to the Crown. But this is not my concern. I am here to secure a speedy conviction. And since your lordship has decided that these antics by the defence shall continue to be allowed, I have no course left to me but to ask the defence to proceed to the remaining part of the indictment. The jury may like to be reminded that it concerns the activities of the prisoner throughout the years 1940, 1941, 1942, and 1943. I doubt whether my learned friend has sufficient political spleen to cover those crimes.
I do not intend to address myself to the court on this count. The prisoner has indicated his desire to speak for himself.
Please proceed.
Your dispositions, your disputations, have proved that you do not understand politics and international affairs. Politics is a naked struggle for power. The only law among states is the law of the jungle. It is the weak who are guilty, and the strong who are righteous. In England, you have a special tradition against the admission of these facts. You like to cover them with a slime of sophistry. Pretend that an almighty providence, usually in the shape of a battleship, settles affairs for the benefit of all. When Francis Drake sailed the seas as a pirate, he did it in the name of the true religion. Cecil Rhodes traveled with a whiskey bottle in one hand, a Bible in the other, and a good supply of gunpowder. Today, you rule India, but of course, only for the benefit of the Indians. You keep your hold on half Africa with the purpose of giving democracy to the black men. And Winston Churchill goes to war to defend your altars from sacrilege and in the name of all the saints. That is the way you have in England, and it serves you well. You bleat like lambs. You still act like tigers. I do not despise you for it. I hate you for it. I pray you for one moment not to deceive yourselves. At least do not condemn me with your hypocrisies. The law of the jungle is still the only law. I read the story of our Risorgimento. It was not the fine ideals of Mazzini which made the United Italy. It was not the benefit of good, kind, benevolent England. A united Italy was born amid the battles of the great powers. Napoleon III was not a romantic lover of liberty. He did not invade Lombardia to advance the cause of human freedom. Nor did your Lord Palmerston approve the expedition out of the kindness of his heart. This is the prattle of the platform, not the reality of politics. Napoleon and Palmerston were glad to see the decline in the power of the Habsburgs. They were glad to see that end achieved at the expense of Italian blood. It was the great powers who united Italy. 400 and 500 years ago, England was an insignificant island in the North Sea. Do you imagine for one moment she became the greatest power on earth by the quality of her laws, the tenderness of her manners, the sweetness of her poetry? England was made great by force. When she had garnered riches from the ends of the earth, she pronounced to the world that the old game of empire building was over. That any attempt of any other nation to do in the future what England had done in the past would be contrary to the covenant of the League of Nations. I was not content to play the game according to your convenient rules. When I came into power, I resolved to make Italy a great power. I played the game well. I used my diplomacy to turn the great powers on each other's throats. In 1935, your leaders came to meet me at Stresa. How they bowed and scurried before me. I, Benito Mussolini, was the dictator of Europe on that day. I was the protector of Austria. And in return for that favor, I was given a free hand in Abyssinia. I saw my dreams coming true. 4 years later, Chamberlain and Halifax came to visit me in Rome and make a Roman holiday. I come to the issue on which I am supposed to address the court. I am accused of the crime of having made war on France and Britain in 1940. Let me explain. I had made a treaty, a military alliance with Germany in 1939. Would you wish me to break my solemn oath? I had good cause, if I had wished, to break the treaty. According to its terms, a war was not to be made on a universal scale until 3 years had passed, and Italy was given time to repair her defenses. And Germany no doubt thought that the attack on Poland would not bring a universal cataclysm. Perhaps Hitler believed that Lord Simon would come forward and say that Poland was not worth the sinking of one British ship. Or that Sir Samuel Hoare would discover some suitable colleague in Paris and concoct a plan for giving half Poland to Germany. Or that Mr. Chamberlain would invite my good officers, as he had once done before, and present an ultimatum in Warsaw, as he had once done in Prague. Or that Lord Halifax would soon make a trip to Berlin and drink a toast to the Emperor of Poland, with the same enthusiasm with which he had once drunk a toast to the Emperor of Ethiopia. Gentlemen, I cannot tell. In any case, I cannot blame Hitler for his miscalculations. I made the same myself. When France had fallen, when the whole world seemed on the brink of a new era, I too believed that all that remained to check the avalanche was the England of Simon and the Hoare and Chamberlain and the Halifax. I could not justify continued neutrality on such weak foundations. It was an error, a tragic error for me and for my country. If I had held my hand at that fateful moment, what prospects would be before me now? What courtings would be proceeding in Rome? What tributes would be paid to my statesmanship? If you condemn me, there will still be others who will battle for the mastery of the globe. Hang me. Shoot me for my failure. But spare me the English hypocrisy of calling it a crime. Statesmen do not commit crimes. In the affairs of nations, there is no criminal code. If you hang me, the ceremony will not end the worship of force. Power is still the God of nations. They will admit no other so long as the world lasts. I advise you to forget your legal fictions and moral rebukes. England will have to fight to keep her place. I foresee an epic of endless wars and stupendous turmoil. And one day, please God, England, with all her shams and subterfuges, will be overturned by some new giant, with a great nation at his back. Perhaps he will raise a monument to the example and memory of Benito Mussolini.
The court and the public will have noticed that the procedure has become somewhat irregular. In the hope of avoiding what he calls a political demonstration, the Attorney General decided not to call any witnesses. It has turned out to have been an unwise course. I, therefore, propose to call those witnesses who are available. I will then give my summing up for the guidance of the jury. I will call on the new witnesses in this order: an Abyssinian, a Spaniard, and an Italian.
Rousseau said he would have planted a gallows at his frontier were he an African chief, for the first immigrating European or the first emigrating native. When our ill armies had been scattered, when our country had been laid waste, when the forces of Benito Mussolini had bombed and gassed their way into Addis Ababa, I thought of this advice and I wished it had been followed. I cannot tell you how bitter was our hate, how tragic was our disillusion. And yet I realized that Rousseau's project was a fantasy, that white and black must live together. They must meet in friendship or in battle. No power under the sun can keep them apart. It was you, the English, who came to our continent among the first. Nobody invited you, and few will seek to justify the purposes for which you came. In subsequent centuries, you have brought many benefits besides. You have brought the science and knowledge, education, and your own religion. Yet, it was not missionary zeal, nor any desire to elevate mankind, which first attracted you to our shores. You came in search of plunder, and the first and richest cargo which you carried away was human flesh. You took our sons to another country, and after 4 centuries you have not yet found it possible to bestow upon them a civilized place in society. In the United States of America, their descendants are still regarded as subhuman. In the British Empire, there is not yet one Negro state where black men direct their own affairs. True, you have given us the name of citizens. Yet when some of the most eminent among them have visited London, their race has been hurled as an insult in their faces. There was a black republic once, 150 years ago, under Toussaint Louverture. Your poets sang his praises, but your statesmen did not accept his example. The rights which he established were not granted by your grace and wisdom. They were won by the strong right arm of black men who learnt the civilizing ideas of the West and turned them to their own account. We often wonder if we would have fared much worse had we relied on our own strength, And had we been allowed through these 150 years to develop our own ways without the blessings of your culture? The question is academic. By your decision and not by our choice, the experiment was not permitted. Africa became the scene for the struggle between the great powers. In that huge orgy, we were lucky if a few crumbs fell from the table to compensate for our wounds. Now, gentlemen, you may ask what relevance these issues bear in the trial of Benito Mussolini. I hope to persuade you. Abyssinia was by no means an ideal state. Many ancient barbarisms were still practiced. It might also be argued that under the tutelage of a civilized Western power, those barbarisms would be more speedily abolished. I cannot answer for that. The example of some African states might suggest yes. The example of others would certainly say no. In any case, this is not the issue. In Abyssinia, black people would have to settle the matter for themselves. Abyssinia was the only part of Africa unconquered by the white man. It was a symbol. And it was a symbol of much more than the black man's capacity to run his own affairs. It was the symbol of the new relation between Africa and Europe, established after the last war, when black peoples also fought by your side. Abyssinia was accepted as a member of the League of Nations. She had equal rights with all other states. And she was the first country in the world to be subdued in defiance of those rights. In defense of those rights. Perhaps you will pardon us if we suppose that the reason why we were allowed to be subjected was to be sought in the color of our skins. It is not merely that we were beaten. That has happened to black peoples before. We were also betrayed. That too has happened to black peoples before, but never before in these same dramatic and novel circumstances. All countries in the League of Nations were pledged to uphold our territorial integrity. All of them agreed in pronouncing Italy guilty. Yet, despite these proclamations, we were denied arms and assistance, and our country went down before gas and bomb. Our lands were bartered at Geneva, carved up in Paris, and when Mussolini's arms were victorious, our leader was compelled to accept moral instructions from Lord Halifax. Now Abyssinia is restored. Yet still the ugly taste of those previous events is not quite gone. There is still a fear at the back of our consciousness. Fear that the foul deed which was done to Abyssinia in 1935 represented the real attitude of Europeans towards men with skin the color of mine. I hope there will be amends for the crime of 1935, for the whole future of Africa. This is my prayer. I demand the death of Benito Mussolini, and I trust that it will be included in the indictment that he was chief among the European rulers in this epoch who believed he could treat Abyssinians like dogs because they were black.
Maybe that Hitler sent his troops to Spain to try out new weapons and to give his commanders military experience. Mussolini could afford no such luxuries. He expected an easy triumph, one which would transform his dream of the Roman lake to very near reality. A Spain conquered in 1936 would have been an Italian Spain. Spain taught free Europe how to resist and how to fight. Badajoz, Talavera, Toledo. In quick succession, the outposts of freedom fell. General Franco swore that he would be in the capital by October. General Mola boasted that he would be drinking coffee in the Puerta del Sol by the 12th. The government of Largo Caballero departed. The Moorish troops came within a fourpenny tram ride to the centre of the city. The Republic was helpless and discredited, said the Times newspaper in London. It was just a faction fight, said Sir Samuel Hoare. Yet fortunately for the editor of the Times and Sir Samuel Hoare, and for the rest of humanity, Madrid did not fall until 3 years after, until the Basques had been pounded into the sea, until the rest of Spain had been sliced in half, until hunger had descended on the beleaguered armies, until muscles were so strained and weary, feet so bleeding, stomachs so empty, that human courage could do no more. Spain was not altogether alone in her battle. She had valuable support from distant Russia. She had other friends too, who were ready to assist her. They came from Nazi prison camps, from fascist prison cells, from Poland, from Canada, from the slums of Glasgow and the back streets of the Ronda. They came to save, but also to avenge. So much they believed could be set right on Spanish fields. Here, they believed the fascist tide could be fought and turned back. Here, they believed they could fight the decisive battles later contested at Annenheim and Stalingrad. Here, they could rescue the peace and the freedom of Europe. For if Mussolini could be overthrown on a Spanish battlefield, the impact would be felt in Rome and Milan and Berlin and soon in Hamburg. It was not an idle calculation, nor was it lack of valor which brought these hopes to naught. Spain was defeated in London and Paris, where ignorant men believed that the peace in Europe would be sustained even if Mussolini conquered, and where cowardly men believed that the freedom of Europe could be salvaged even if Spain was a corpse. It was by no act of the statesman in London that Mussolini was prevented from gaining the most menacing of his triumphs. That service was performed by ragged, ill-equipped armies, sometimes called scum. They had to fight against a Mussolini whose perfect good faith was applauded in the British House of Commons. To the blind eyes and stony hearts of some gentlemen in London, Mussolini was a better friend of peace than Dr. Negrin, who refused to perform the task pretended for France in 1940. And while the Italian ambassador in London was being received in the salons of Mayfair, the International Brigade were helping to win a battle in Guadalajara for England and the world. Values have changed since those evil days. London and Stalingrad have fought like Madrid, yet in heroism neither city needs to seek a better comparison than Madrid. Spain has known she must for a while submit to this purgatory. A fear that the debt for her valour and her agony may be forgotten. She cannot believe that England will show such mercy for Franco, who assisted in Axis when the Axis was strong, who even prophesied an Axis victory. Spain cannot believe that the people of England would be guilty of such ingratitude and dishonour. Spain is only discomforted to learn of the luncheon parties held at the Spanish embassy in London by the Duke of Alba and attended by the British Prime Minister and a British Foreign Secretary. Spain trusts that such trifles mean nothing. A start in repaying the debt can be made in this court. I demand the death of Mussolini. Let the crime done to Spain be given preeminence on the charge sheet. I am ashamed of what has been done.
in the name of my country. But the shame for what has been done in Europe during the past 25 years must be shared by many countries. It was a challenge to all Europe, and for a long while Europe failed. By the same reckoning, there are many Italians and many Germans who must be acquitted from the general charge which is sometimes laid upon them. By the necessity of their circumstances, it was Italians who first fought fascism in Europe. They fought fascism when many others who now lay the guilt on the whole bulk of the Italian people were falling on it. Countless street battles, the prisons where anti-fascists were detained, stand as monuments to Italian hatred of fascism. I will not seek to excuse what was done in Italy. I will try to explain it. The great error committed by the Italians was in ever allowing Mussolini to establish himself in power. Once that blunder had been committed, it wasn't easy to be revoked. Where was the blunder made? The crime of the right was that they preferred fascism to reform. They were ready first to employ Mussolini's hooligans on the streets, next to employ Mussolini himself. The blunder of the left was that they did not drive home their advantage when they had it. They did not fight with sufficient strength and unity of purpose to secure their gains. This is a dilemma and a failure which has recurred in Europe since that day. Mark it well for the future. Mark well those who dislike socialist reform, that you do not sell your country to fascism. Mark well those who are resolved on socialist reform, that you fight strongly enough for your faith, or you too may not be able to disown the guilt. Let me plead only in mitigation of the offences committed by the Italians. Italy was the first victim of the scientific terror of fascism. Even so, the Italian people did not go down without a fight. Only after many months was Mussolini able to exterminate, expel, imprison, and exile on a sufficient scale to count himself safe. What is the chief problem of fascism today? He was asked at the time. Its duration, he replied. I will not deny that he won many adherents. Indeed, that he brutalized great numbers, infected them with his doctrines. But I would plead that they were not all won over by the clockwork trains, the drained marshes, and the new buildings. Mussolini did do some things for Italy, but the trains that ran on time were no compensation to the land worker who must still live on a penury. Even the drained marshes were more popular in England than they were among the people who were conscripted to dig them. What were Italians to do? The question was asked 10 million times in fascist Italy. No answer was given. 10 million more times it was asked, and still there was silence. 10 million times more. At last came a faint answer, the kind which prisoners hear when they tap their knuckles on the walls of their cells, and hear in response the smallest sound in the distance. Revolt began in Italy with men crawling on their hands and knees in the darkness. It was no easy task to get 50,000 men out on strike in Milan in March 1943. It was no easy task to organize the 100 other signs of resistance which finally turned Mussolini off his throne. It was not the king and Badoglio who brought this to his end. They could have done it. They could have done it 21 years before, if they had been so minded. It was uproar in Milan, organized revolt, the joyful reception of the Allies in Palermo, which compelled the king, at last, to take the remnants of courage in his hands. When Italy finally made peace, it was the people who did it. The world owes much to the fact that fascism achieved no final conquest in Italy. Democracy should be proud that she found such friends in Palermo, in Milan, and in Turin. Yet in this knowledge, how much greater appears the injury done by Mussolini. I demand the death of Benito Mussolini, but I claim that first in the catalogue of his crimes should be counted the torture he did to his native land.
I began by describing this trial as unique. Its peculiar character arises from the fact that in passing judgment on the prisoner, the court must also pass judgment on many other political questions. It is bound to arise in any case of political crime, because no politician performs his actions in a vacuum. He must have associates, accomplices, enemies, and the final deed must depend on their actions too. It would be clear folly to hold Mussolini and his associate in Berlin solely responsible for the war. If that is all we are able to learn, another war is inevitable. However, the fact that others must share the guilt need not absolve the prisoner. It is clear that most of the witnesses have no particular quarrel with the behavior of the prisoner before 1940. Most have been ready to acquit Mussolini of any serious crime before that date. When he was merely a fascist dictator, they applauded him. When he was merely a breaker of international treaties, they made new treaties with him. But as he was ambitious to make war on England, they would slay him. If you decide to convict Mussolini merely on this basis, you will not have found him guilty of any crime committed against the Abyssinians, the Spaniards, or the Italians for over 20 years. Although Mussolini is condemned, fascism will leave this court acquitted. We are confronted with a claim made by the counsel for the defense that there is no standard of international morality whereby the prisoner can be judged or condemned. To sustain this claim, counsel pointed to the many breaches of solemn treaties by British statesmen, their readiness to connive at the subjection of countries which had committed no offence so long as it permitted an easy accommodation with the conqueror. If this original claim be true, then also it will be difficult to condemn the prisoner. But is it true? Is it true that there is no standard of international conduct? When Italy fought for her freedom and unity in the 19th century, English policy over a long period was directed to assist her in that object. The people of Tyneside made a presentation to General Garibaldi, and he replied, "The English people gave us men, arms and money because they always held all the needs and necessities of the human race." Gladstone could not keep silent when he saw the horrors of the Neapolitan prisons. And when Gladstone died, the Italian Parliament met to mourn him. You will not fail to note a certain contrast between these events and the events of the past 10 years which we have been discussing in this court. When the peoples of Tyneside and the Ronde and Glasgow collected their hard-earned pennies to send to Spain, they were discouraged by the rulers of Britain and even condemned as warmongers. Was there any governing statesman who took action, such as Gladstone's, to condemn the horrors of concentration camps of fascism? No. They were too busy making pacts with the jailers. Gentlemen, I hope you will find the contrast sufficiently striking. I suggest it is a moral contrast. I hope I have said enough to prove that there is morality in international affairs. Let us abandon the dangerous cant that England should not interest herself in the internal affairs of other countries. It was that folly which permitted the fostering of fascism in Italy during the early years. During that period when fascism was building the base from which it later led to war, Mussolini's regime was assisted, sustained and supported by foreign and sometimes English aid. Suppose fascism had been ostracized. Suppose a new Gladstone had rallied the world against the murder of Matteotti. Suppose Italy had been expelled from the League instead of being allowed boastfully to resign. It might not have been necessary then to have made war on fascism. It is necessary that England should concern herself with the assistance of the cause of freedom in other lands. It is necessary that a new League of Nations shall be founded, clearly resolved to maintain the peace and advance the well-being of their peoples. Surely it is exactly this doctrine which underlies the association of the United Nations. Mussolini prophesied a new age of war and turmoil, in which an adventurer more successful than himself would at last arise to challenge and defeat the leaguered England. So strange a convolution in the affairs of mankind may seem fantastic. I would persuade you not to be so certain. We live in an age of young ideas and violent commotion, comparable with that which convulsed Europe during the wars of religion. Changes were swift then. Changes might be swifter now. It is only by our exertions that we can surely forestall a new counter-revolution. It is only by interesting ourselves in the internal affairs of other states that we shall detect danger in the womb. It is only by fighting ideological war that we shall assist in bringing a grander freedom to mankind. If having fought for her liberty we connived at dictatorship, the peoples of Europe will be left only to cry amid their continued agony. Gentlemen, these are issues for the future. Throughout this epoch, which allowed the rise of the prisoner, there have been two Englands. The England of the Chamberlains, the Simons and the Hores, and another England. This other England detested fascism. It fought against the betrayal of Abyssinia. It denounced the massacres of Spain. It struggled to build an international society. This was the England of the left, the England of Labour, which made this country the leader of the nations in the 19th century. This England made errors too, but they were errors of a quite different nature from those who thought they could reach comfortable terms of settlement with fascism. This other England was kept alive. Faith in this other England survived even in betrayed Abyssinia and stricken Spain. It was the resurrection of this other England which saved the world. It is necessary to present the issue in this political form. Without it, the trial becomes a farce. There is no need, therefore, for you to exclude from your judgment any part of this indictment. If you are not to mock those who have fought and died in this war, the whole career of this fascist dictator is a fitting subject for your verdict. I leave the decision to you. I invite you to give your verdict.
Dai, non potevo aspettare il caso.